You want my what? The farmer squinted down from his porch at the 16-year-old standing in his yard. That old pipe? Son, that's rusted out junk. Been rotting in the fence row since before you were born. Yes, sir. That's the one I want. The man laughed. Take it. Take all of it. What in the world's a Coleman boy gonna do with a heap of busted irrigation pipe? Elijah Coleman didn't answer. He just loaded it onto his father's flatbed and drove to the next farm. And the next. All summer long, door after door, the same laughter followed him down every dirt road in the county. By August, he had more pipe than some working farms. And nobody, not one soul, not even his own father, knew why. Before Elijah Coleman was hauling anyone's pipe, he was a boy who watched water. The Coleman farm sat on a slow rise of land in the southern part of the county, where the fields ran down toward a creek that had been the family's boundary line for 5 generations. That was a number people said out loud in those parts, and the Colemans said it too, though quieter than most. 5 generations meant something particular when you were one of the few black families in the county who had held onto their ground through all the years that took ground away. Roland Coleman knew the exact acreage his great-great-grandfather had started with, and he knew how much of it was left. And the difference between those two numbers was a thing he carried around behind his eyes, even when he was smiling. Roland worked the land the way his father had, except that his father hadn't needed a second job to do it. 3 nights a week, Roland drove 40 minutes to a parts plant on the edge of the next town and stood at a line until the early morning, then came home and slept a few hours and went out to the fields. His wife, Denise, kept the house and the kitchen garden and a ledger that she did not like anyone reading over her shoulder. And in a small room off the back of the house, Elijah's grandfather, Amos, spent his mornings at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee gone cold and a stack of agricultural extension pamphlets he had been collecting since the 1960s. Amos read those pamphlets the way other men read scripture. He had farmed this same ground for the better part of 50 years before his knees gave out, and now he sat and read about soil and water and root systems and let his grandson bring him more coffee. It was Amos who first noticed that the boy was looking at the fields wrong. Or not wrong, different. "You watch that low corner," Amos said one morning, not turning around, because he'd heard Elijah come in from the porch. "Where the water sets after a rain." Elijah stopped in the doorway. "It stays dark down there 2 days longer than the top of the field." "I know it does." The old man turned a page. "Question is whether you know why it matters." That was the difference in the boy. The other kids his age looked at a field and saw the crop, saw the money, saw the chores. Elijah looked at a field and saw where the water went, where it pooled, where it ran off before it could do anybody any good, where the soil cracked first in a dry stretch and where it held on longest. He had been looking at fields that way since he was small, and Amos was the only one who had ever put a name to it. That summer, the looking stopped being a quiet habit and became something with weight behind it, because that summer the county went into its 3rd year of rain that never quite came. The drought had been a slow thing at first, the kind of dry that farmers argue about and hope out of. But by the 3rd year, there was nothing to argue. The creek ran thin. The dust came up behind every truck on every road and hung there. And the upper field on the Coleman place, the one where the soil turned sandy and let water slip straight through, began to burn. It was the soybean field, and it was the field Roland could least afford to lose. Elijah watched the plants in the high rows go pale at the leaf tips, then curl. He watched his father walk those rows in the evenings with his hands on his hips and his jaw set, doing arithmetic that Elijah could read on his face without hearing a word of it. The extension agent came out twice. He was a decent enough man named Grady Fulton, and he stood in the field and said the things the situation called for. Irrigate more often. Mulch the base of the plants to hold the moisture in. Elijah stood a few feet off and listened to every word, because he had learned that the answer and the reason for the answer were 2 different things, and adults mostly gave you the first without the second. More often costs diesel, Roland said after Grady Fulton had driven off. He wasn't really talking to his son. He was talking to the field. And the pressure won't carry the line up the rise anyhow. Loses everything halfway across. What happens to the water that doesn't make it to the top? Elijah asked. His father looked at him like the question had come from farther away than the boy standing there. It just stops. Sits in the pipe. Elijah nodded, slow, the way a person nods when they've been turning something over for a good while and have just been handed the last corner of it. He heard the real trouble a week later, and he wasn't meant to hear it. He came in from the barn in the dark, and his father was on the phone in the kitchen, voice low, and the words that reached Elijah in the hallway were, "The North Quarter, and if it comes to that, and we'd get through the winter." Roland was standing at the window with his back to the door, and Denise was sitting at the table with her ledger closed under both her hands, not looking at it. And the room had the particular stillness of a decision nobody wanted to be the one to say out loud. Elijah went back out to the porch and sat on the step and understood, all at once and completely, that this was not about a bad soybean crop. A bad crop was a bad year. What his father was talking about selling was a piece of the ground that 5 generations had bled to keep, and once a piece went, it did not come back. Land that left a family like his did not get bought back cheap, or at all. He had heard the old men talk. He knew how it went. He sat out there a long time in the dark with the dry smell of the fields coming up off the ground, and somewhere in that stretch, the watching turned into something else. Because Elijah had been reading Amos's pamphlets too. He'd started with the drip irrigation ones, the systems that fed water straight to the roots through slow emitters, instead of throwing it up in the air to burn off in the sun. The ones that claimed you could grow the same crop on a fraction of the water because none of it evaporated off hot ground or ran down a slope unused. And from the drip pamphlets, he'd wandered into the older ones, the yellowed booklets from before electric pumps were in every barn, back when men moved water the only way there was to move it without machinery. Downhill. Gravity did the carrying. Water sitting high ran through pipe to fields sitting low, and it cost nothing to run because nothing ran it but the weight of the water itself. The trouble was that the pond on the Coleman place sat at the bottom of the property, below everything, and you could not make water climb. Elijah had turned that over and set it down disappointed more than once. But there was the draw on the north edge. A shallow catch in the land where rainwater gathered after a storm and stood for days, a flat brown sheet of it soaking slowly in before the sun took the rest. He had crossed that draw 100 times without thinking about it as anything but a wet spot. Sitting on the step in the dark, he thought about it differently. That draw was up the slope from the dying soybeans. Not by much. He'd have to measure it to be sure, and he measured it the next day with a line and a level his grandfather had used 40 years ago, and the number came out to about 9 feet. 9 feet of fall, from the catch to the high rows. He sat with the pamphlets that night and did the arithmetic the way the old booklets laid it out. Head pressure against pipe run against emitter flow, and 9 feet was enough. 9 feet, routed right, was enough to run a gravity drip line across a 1/4 acre without a single pump, without a drop of diesel, without any of the water pressure that the Coleman farm did not have and could not buy. The water was already there, standing in the draw, free, doing nothing. It only needed a road to travel down and a slow way to arrive. What it needed was pipe. A great deal of pipe. More pipe than was lying in the Coleman barn, more than Elijah had money to buy new, more than any sensible person would ever imagine a 16-year-old could get his hands on. But pipe was the one thing the county had lying around going to waste, same as that water in the draw. Every farm he knew had a stretch of old aluminum lateral rotting in the weeds at the edge of a field, replaced years back and never hauled off, worth less than the trouble of moving it. Men would be glad to see it gone. All he had to do was ask, and haul, and keep at it. He knew exactly how it would look. He knew what the boys in town would say, and he knew that the men whose fields he'd be knocking on would lean back and chuckle and hand him their junk with the particular kindness people show a child they've already decided is wasting his time. He would spend his whole summer being the thing the county laughed at, while his father decided whether to sell the ground out from under all of them. He could let that stop him, or he could build the thing. Elijah found his father in the barn the next morning, before the drive to the plant, oiling a hinge that didn't need it because it gave his hands something to do. "I want to try something on the upper field," Elijah said. "It won't cost you anything. Won't cost diesel. I need to use the flatbed, and I need you to not sell the north quarter until the beans come in." Roland straightened up slowly and looked at his son for a while, and whatever he'd been about to say, he set it down. "You heard that." "I heard it. It's not a thing I want to do." "I know it isn't. That's why I'm asking for the summer." Roland turned the oil can over in his hands. He was a man who trusted work he could see and was slow to trust anything else, and he did not ask what the boy was building, because asking was a way of doubting, and he wasn't ready to do that to his own son's face. "Flatbed's got a soft tire on the right rear," he said finally. "Air it before you take it anywhere." That was all. But that was Roland saying yes. Elijah aired the tire that same afternoon, and the next Saturday morning he drove out to the first farm on his list and knocked on a door and asked a grown man for the rusted pipe rotting at the edge of his field. And the man leaned against his porch rail and laughed the gentle, baffled laugh Elijah had known was coming, and told him to help himself, son. Take all of it. And Elijah loaded it onto the flatbed and did not explain himself, and drove on to the next farm on the list. He did that for weeks. Some mornings he came home with the flatbed riding low on its springs, and some mornings with 2 lengths of dented lateral and a long drive for the trouble. But he kept the list, and he worked it, farm by farm, and he did not tell a single one of them what the pipe was for. One morning, near the end of June, he pulled into the yard of a farmer named Purvis Lundy, who was known around the county for being tight with everything he owned, even things he had no use for. Lundy came out and looked at the boy and looked at the flatbed and asked what a coalman wanted with his old lateral, and Elijah told him the truth as far as it went, which was that he had a use for it. Lundy didn't like that answer. He wanted the rest of it, and when Elijah wouldn't give the rest of it, the man's face closed up, and for a minute it looked like the boy would drive off empty. Then Lundy's wife came to the door and said, "Purvis, that pipe's been rotting in the fence row since before the boy was born. Let him have it." And Lundy waved a hand and turned back into the house, and Elijah loaded it. He learned something at Lundy's place that stuck with him better than the pipe did, which was that people would give away almost anything, so long as you didn't make them feel foolish for having kept it. Part of the not telling was pride, and part of it was something steadier than pride. He had failed at nothing yet, but he already knew, the way you know weather, that he was going to fail at it some before he was done, and he did not want a soul standing over the failing but himself. By the middle of July, he had his pipe. It lay stacked along the north side of the barn in lengths sorted by size, aluminum lateral gone chalky with age, elbows and couplers of every mismatched kind, and a roll of drip tape he'd bought new at the farm supply in town with money saved from a spring of odd jobs. He had trenched the run by hand across the top of the soybean field, shallow channels dug with a spade in the cool of the mornings before the heat set in. And his father had come out one weekend without a word and dug alongside him for 2 hours before the drive to the plant. And that was the closest either of them came to talking about what any of it was for. His grandfather's pamphlets had told him how it was supposed to work. They had not told him how it actually worked, which turned out to be a different and less forgiving thing. The first time Elijah ran water into the system, it failed before it got 10 yards down the slope. He opened the catch at the draw and watched the water start down the main line, and where the first 3 joints met, it came seeping out at the couplings, thin at first and then not thin, running down the outside of the pipe and into the dirt where it did nobody any good. Half the head he'd counted on was leaking into the ground before it ever reached a plant. He crouched over the nearest joint and put his thumb against it and felt the water push past, and understood that the pamphlet's clean diagram and his pile of 40-year-old couplings were not the same thing at all. That would have been discouragement enough. But the trouble did not stay in the field. A couple of boys from town drove past on the county road that afternoon, slowed down, and saw Elijah out there on his knees in the dirt among a spread of rusted pipe with water leaking out of it in 3 directions. Word of Coleman's junk pile had already made its rounds, and now there was a picture to go with it. By evening it was on their phones and passed around. The Coleman boy and his heap of scrap, and the joke that had been a gentle porch rail chuckle got a harder edge to it in the mouths of kids his own age. It was one thing for a grown man to hand a boy his old pipe and smile. It was another to be 16 and be the thing the whole town was laughing at on a screen. Elijah heard about it the way you hear about those things, sideways, from his younger cousin who thought he ought to know. He didn't say anything about it at supper. He turned it over that night in the dark, the picture of himself on all those phones. And there was a version of the evening where he decided the whole idea had been foolish and left the pipe where it lay and let the summer close over it. He got close enough to that version to feel the shape of it. Then he thought about his father at the window saying the north quarter, and the closing over did not happen. His mother found him at the kitchen table late that same night, the pamphlet open under the lamp and his figures crossed out and figured again down the margin of a feed store receipt. She set a plate down in front of him without being asked, the way she did, and she did not tell him to come to bed, and she did not tell him the thing was foolish, which was what he was braced for. She stood behind his chair a moment, looking down at the crossed-out figures she couldn't read the meaning of. "Your daddy doesn't ask people for things," Denise said. "Neither do I. We were raised that it was close to begging." She set her hand flat on the table beside his sheet. "You went and asked half the county for their trash and didn't blink. I don't know where you got that from. But don't let me hear you talk about quitting it now that the asking's done." She went off to bed, and Elijah ate the plate, and went out the next morning and wrapped every joint in the failed run with plumber's tape, seating each coupling by hand and working the tape into the threads the way the pamphlet's small print had told him, and he had skipped over the first time because he'd been in a hurry to see water move. It took most of a day. He did not hurry this time. The second run got farther. The water held through the first joints and traveled down the main line and reached the head of the field, and Elijah felt something lift in his chest watching it come. Then it reached the emitters, and the lift went back out of him. What came out of the drip tape was not the slow, steady seep the pamphlets promised. It was a thin, uneven trickle, strong at the couple of emitters nearest the top and dying off to almost nothing further down the row. A few plants got their water. Most of them got a damp ring in the dust and no more. He walked the whole quarter-acre reading emitters like a man taking a pulse, and by the end of it he understood that the system was carrying water, but it wasn't carrying enough, and it wasn't sharing what it carried. Something upstream of the emitters was wrong, and no amount of plumber's tape was going to fix it, because this time nothing was leaking. The water was simply arriving with no strength left in it. He stood at the bottom of the row a long while looking at the damp rings drying up in the sun almost as fast as they'd come, and this was the low point of the whole summer, though he did not have a name for it then. 2 tries gone, the beans worse than when he'd started, the town laughing on their phones, and a wrong somewhere in his own work that he could not see. He went back to the pamphlets because there was nowhere else to go. He read them differently now, the way you read instructions after you've already failed once and know which parts you can't afford to skim. And this time a passage caught that had meant nothing to him in May. A few dry paragraphs about pipe diameter and flow rate, about how the width of a pipe governed not only how much water it could move, but how quickly the pressure evened itself out across the length of a run. A line too narrow choked the flow and starved everything past the first stretch. It was not a leak he was fighting. It was the shape of the pipe itself. The salvaged sections he'd used for his main line were too small in the bore to carry the head he had. He needed to step the diameter up at the collector, run the wide pipe where the water gathered, and step it back down only out at the emitter lines. It was in the booklet in plain enough words. He had read past it twice. He was sitting on the back step with the pamphlet open on his knee when the screen door came open behind him, and his grandfather worked his way out onto the porch. one hand on the frame and the other on his cane, and lowered himself down onto the step beside the boy with the care of a man whose knees had made every stair a negotiation for years. Amos didn't ask what had gone wrong. He looked out at the field, at the dark trench line running across the top of it and the pale plants below, and he was quiet for a stretch that had nothing hurried in it. "Diameter," Elijah said finally because he couldn't keep it in. "The main line's too narrow. It's choking before it ever gets to the row." "That'd do it," Amos nodded slowly. "You know how I learned that?" Elijah looked over at him. "Man named Otis Reed, county agent back when I was younger than your daddy is now. Colored agent, they called him then. Sent around to the farms like ours because the regular man wouldn't always come." The old man turned that over for a moment, some old weight in it. "He sat at my father's table with these same booklets, or ones like them, and he taught us how to move water. Diameter and fall and flow. Same numbers you're chasing right now on the same ground. I put it in a drawer when the pump came in and the electric got run out here, and I didn't think about it for 40 years. He tapped the pamphlet on Elijah's knee with one crooked finger. "You dug it back out. Didn't even know you were doing it." Elijah looked down at the yellowed page, at the diagram he'd read past twice, and something settled in him that was steadier than encouragement. It wasn't a thing he'd made up out of nowhere and dragged his family's ground into. It was a thing that had been done on this same land by people he came from and lost, and he was the one who'd found it again. "I need bigger pipe," he said. "Then you'd best go find some," said Amos. Finding it was its own wall. The wide sections he needed were not the kind of thing rotting free in the weeds at the edge of every field. Big-bore pipe was commercial equipment, and commercial equipment had value, and the men who had it either used it or knew what it was worth. Elijah did not have money to buy it. He had a barn full of narrow salvage that had turned out to be the wrong shape for the job, and a summer that was burning down toward August with the beans burning right along with it. The one man he could think of was Wendell Coe. Coe was a retired farmer out on the west side of the county who had run a commercial vegetable operation until he'd shut it down some years back, and folks said his barn still held all the irrigation gear from that outfit, coiled and stacked and going nowhere. He was also a white man of a certain age and a certain reputation for keeping to himself, and Elijah had never had a reason to knock on his door. And driving out there with his particular request was not a small thing to work himself up to. He thought about it for a day, and then he aired the soft tire and drove out anyway, because the beans did not care what was easy. Coe came out onto his porch and heard the boy out with his arms folded and his face giving away nothing. Elijah laid it out plain. The gravity system, the draw, the diameter he'd gotten wrong, the trade he was proposing, his stack of narrow salvage for a run of Coe's wider pipe. The old man let him finish and then stood there looking at him for a good while, and Elijah could not read whether he was being weighed or dismissed. "Gravity feed," Coe said at last. "No pump. No pump. 9 feet of fall off the draw. Off that shallow catch on your north line." It wasn't a question. Coe knew the ground. "Everybody around here treats that draw like a puddle. It's about 4,000 gallons standing after a good rain," Elijah said. "Doing nothing." Something moved at the corner of the old man's mouth that was not quite a smile, but was headed in that direction. He came down off the porch and walked Elijah out to the barn without another word, and slid the door back on a stack of pipe that made the boy's chest go tight just to look at it, and started pulling the sizes Elijah needed and laying them out in the dirt. When they had it sorted, Elijah started loading his own narrow salvage off the flatbed to make the trade, and Coe watched him do it for a minute and then told him to leave it. He didn't want the small stuff. He had a barn full of his own. "Take the wide pipe." Elijah started to say something about that not being fair, and Coe cut him off. "I closed that operation in 2009, the old man said, "and that pipe's been laying in there rusting ever since, worth nothing to me but the room it takes up. You're the first person in 15 years to come out here with a use for it that made me want to hear the end of the sentence." He looked at the boy, and the almost smile came the rest of the way out. "I like a stubborn kid. Haul it off before I think better of it." He did not think better of it. Ko walked the rows of his own emptying barn while the boy loaded, running a hand along the stacked pipe he was giving away, and it seemed to Elijah that the old man was glad of the emptying, that the equipment had been sitting there 15 years, reminding him of a thing he'd closed down, and that watching a boy carry it off to grow something was easier on him than looking at it every morning. He didn't say any of that. He carried the far ends of the heavy sections down to the flatbed himself, a retired man with a bad hip taking his half of the weight so a 16-year-old wouldn't have to take all of it, and the two of them worked without much talk until the load was on. It took 2 trips with the flatbed. On the second one, Ko rode out to the Coleman place to see the layout for himself, and stood at the head of the field with his hands in his back pockets, looking at the trench line and the draw and the fall of the land, and told Elijah where he'd have set the collector a foot lower. And Elijah listened, because the man had run water for a living, and Elijah had run it twice and failed both times. Something had opened up between them out there in the dust that neither of them named. An old white farmer and a black boy of 16 standing in a dying field, talking about diameter and fall, as if the rest of the county and all its long, quiet lines had no say in it at all. That was the middle of July gone and most of the way into August. And now everything the summer had come to sat on one more attempt. Elijah rebuilt the whole run. He tore out the narrow main line he'd sweated over and laid Ko's wide pipe from the collector down, stepping the diameter down only where the emitter lines branched off the way the pamphlet had finally made him understand. He reset the collector a foot lower, the way Ko had said. He wrapped every joint again. It took him 4 days working every hour that wasn't dark, and by the end of it his hands were raw, and his father's soft-tired flatbed was empty, and the beans in the high rows had gone from pale to something worse, the leaves curling in on themselves in the heat like they were trying to take up less room in a world that had stopped giving them water. He knew what was riding on the run. Not just the summer, though the summer was in it. The whole town had watched him haul junk for 2 months and laughed, and the boys had put it on their phones. And if this failed too, then every one of them had been right, and he'd have proved it to them with his own 2 hands. And underneath all of that was the thing he did not let himself look at straight, which was his father at the kitchen window in the dark saying the North Quarter, and the ledger under his mother's hands, and the arithmetic that was only getting worse the longer the beans burned. The evening before he opened the catch for the 3rd time, Elijah walked the whole run alone in the last of the light, checking every joint he'd already checked twice. His grandfather watched him from the porch. His father was on the drive to the plant. The field was silent except for the dry, ticking sound the heat made in the leaves, and the boy stood at the head of it with his hand on the collector, 16 years old and entirely out of pipe, out of summer, and out of ways to be wrong twice and come back a 3rd time. There was nothing left to check. There was only the morning and the water, and whether 9 feet of fall and everything he'd learned the hard way would carry it down the slope this last time, or whether the whole county had been right to laugh. Morning came the way August mornings came that year, the sky already going the color of old brass before the sun was full up, the heat waiting just off the ground for the day to lift it. Elijah was at the head of the field before his father got back from the plant. His grandfather was on the porch with his cold coffee, too far off to help and too invested to stay inside. There was nobody else to see it, which was how Elijah wanted it, because if it failed a 3rd time, he did not want an audience for the failing. He put his hand on the collector and opened the catch. The water started down out of the draw and into the wide pipe, and this time Elijah could hear the difference before he could see it. The wide bore filled with a low, full sound instead of the thin rush of the narrow line, the sound of water moving with something behind it. He walked the run down the slope alongside the pipe, not fast, watching the joints he'd wrapped 3 days running, and every joint held. No seep, no dark lines spreading in the dust at the couplings. The water went where he'd sent it and nowhere else. He reached the head of the field and crouched at the first emitter and waited. It came slow. That was the thing he'd gotten wrong twice and could not afford to misread now, because slow was what it was supposed to be. The pamphlets had promised a seep, not a gush. Water arriving at the root a little at a time so the ground could take all of it in, and none of it ran off or burned away. He watched the first emitter darken the soil in a spreading ring, steady, and then the next one down the road did the same, and the next, and he moved down the line on his knees in the dirt, reading emitter after emitter, and every one of them was giving, not the strong, then dying stagger of the second attempt, but an even, patient seep the whole length of the run. The wide collector had done what the booklet said it would. The pressure had evened itself out across the field, and the water was sharing. Elijah stayed down in the dirt at the far end of the row longer than he needed to. There was nobody to see, so he let himself feel it all the way through before he stood up. From the porch, his grandfather lifted his coffee cup a couple of inches off the arm of the chair, which was as much as Amos was going to do about it from that distance. And it was enough. The beans did not turn around overnight. That was not how beans worked, and Elijah knew it. And the not knowing whether it had come in time was its own particular ache through the back half of that week. He went out to the high rows 3 and 4 times a day, more than the plants needed him, and more than he could stand to admit, crouching at the same emitters, reading the same slow rings darken in the soil, telling himself the color in the leaves was coming up, and then telling himself he was only seeing what he wanted to see. There is a particular cruelty in a thing that works too late, and he did not know yet which kind of week this was. The heat did not let up to help him decide. Every afternoon the sky went to brass, and the other fields in the county gave up a little more, and he would stand at the edge of his quarter-acre unable to tell hour to hour whether he was watching a recovery or a slower way of dying. But the plants had gone from curling to holding, and then, over a handful of days of that slow, even water going down to the roots, while the sun did its worst to every other field in the county, they began to come back. The leaves opened. The color came up in them from the pale yellow-green of a plant that is giving up to the deep upright green of a plant that has decided to live. By the middle of the week after, the high rows that had been dying were the darkest, fullest stretch of soybeans on the Coleman place, and the canopy had closed over the trench line so you could barely see where the water ran. Roland was the one who noticed the number, though he noticed the field first. He came in off a night at the plant and slept his few hours and went out to walk the beans the way he did, and Elijah watched from the barn as his father stopped at the head of the upper field and stood there. Then Roland walked down into the high rows, the ones he'd walked with his hands on his hips doing the arithmetic that had a piece of the north quarter in it. And he walked them slow, and he walked them a second time, which Roland did not do. He crouched the way his son had crouched and put his hand down into the soil at the base of a plant and came up with dirt that was dark and damp clear through in the middle of the driest August the county had seen in 3 years. He found Elijah by the barn. "How much water is this taking?" he said. Not quite a question the way his father asked things. Elijah told him. He'd kept the figure because he'd known his father would ask it. It came to something near 2/5 of what it would have taken to keep that same ground green by the ordinary means, and most of that saving was the water that used to burn off the top of hot soil, or run down the slope and never reach a root at all. On the upper field, the old overhead line had never really carried at all, of course, which was the whole trouble they'd started with. This was water that used to be lost turned into water that got used, and the number said it plainly. Roland did not say anything for a while, and it was not the silence of a man working up to praise. It was the silence of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped feeling it as separate from himself, and finding out what his hands felt like without it. When he did speak, it was not about the beans. "I'll call the fellow back about the north quarter," he said. "Tell him we're not selling." That was all he said about it. But Elijah understood that his father had just told him the ground was staying, all of it, and that the thing the boy had built out of other men's junk in a summer everyone laughed at had bought back a piece of 5 generations that had already been half gone out the door. Word traveled after that the way word does. Brady Fulton came back out, and this time it was official. notebook in hand, walking the whole run with Elijah and asking the kind of questions a man asks when he is recalibrating something he thought he already understood. The extension agent had seen a good deal of irrigation in his years, and he told Elijah plainly that he had never seen a gravity-fed drip network built out of salvage produce a result like this on a family farm, and that he wanted to bring an agricultural engineering student out from the university in the spring to measure it properly. A woman from the county paper came after that and wrote it up, and it ran on the front page below the fold with a photograph of Elijah at the head of the field and a word in the headline he found embarrassing, which was innovator. He didn't feel like an innovator. He felt like a boy who had failed twice and read the small print the third time. And then the ones who had laughed started to come. They came a few at a time, in trucks, down the dirt road to the Coleman place. The men who had leaned on their porch rails and handed a 16-year-old their rotting pipe with a chuckle and a, "Help yourself, son." Some of the boys came too, the ones who'd slowed on the county road and put the junk pile on their phones, though they hung back at the edge of the field and let the grown men go first. They came out expecting most of them to be neighborly about it, to look at whatever the Coleman boy had cobbled together and say something kind and drive home. They were not ready for the field, because the upper field was a different color than any field in the county. All around it the county lay burnt and thin and yellow from the long, dry summer, corn curling, beans gone pale and giving up. And there in the middle of it stood Elijah's quarter acre, dense and deep green, the canopy so full it had closed over the ground beneath, the plants standing straight and heavy with pods, every leaf turned up to the light like the whole stand of them had something to be proud of. A few of the men walked the rows without a word. One of them, a big weathered farmer named Dale Hutchins, who had been one of the first to hand the boy his old pipe, and one of the first to laugh, crouched down and pulled a pod off the nearest plant and split it open with his thumbnail. He looked at the beans inside it for a long moment. Then he looked up at the boy standing at the edge of the field with dirt on his boots, the same boy he'd watched wrestle scrap onto a flatbed all summer. "What'd you do different?" Hutchins said. So Elijah showed them. He walked them up to the draw first, the shallow catch on the north line every one of them had crossed 1,000 times and thought of as a puddle, and he told them how much water stood in it after a rain, and how it had been doing nothing but soaking away and drying up for as long as any of them had farmed near it. He walked them down the fall of the land, the 9 feet of drop from the catch to the high rows, and told them that was all it took, 9 feet, no pump, no diesel, nothing running the water down the pipe but its own weight. He showed them the collector, the wide bore where the water gathered and the pressure evened out, and the way the line stepped down where the emitter runs branched off. He got down on his knees in front of them and lifted a length of drip tape and showed them the emitters running slow and steady just under the soil, the water going straight to the root a little at a time. None of it thrown up in the air to burn off in the sun. None of it running down the slope to pool somewhere and vanish. The same water these men had watched puddle and disappear off their own ground their whole lives, and never once thought twice about. He walked them through every joint, every mismatched coupling, every length of chalky aluminum lateral that had been headed for a scrap pile at the edge of somebody's field until he'd knocked on a door and asked for it, and been laughed at and handed it anyway. He did not say any of that last part out loud. He didn't have to. Every man standing in that field had handed him a piece of what was under their boots, and they knew it, and the knowing moved through them quietly as he talked. The laughter was gone. In its place was the thing that takes longer to arrive than laughter and outlasts it by a good deal, and Dale Hutchins was the one who put words to it, turning the split pod over in his thick fingers. "My daddy's pipe," he said half to himself. "I gave you my daddy's old pipe out of the fence row and laughed doing it." He shook his head slowly. "And you grew that with it." One of the boys came up out of the pack while the men were still talking, the one who'd taken the picture on the county road back in July. And he stood at the edge of the green rows with his hands shoved in his pockets and couldn't seem to find the front of whatever he'd come to say. Elijah waited him out. What came finally wasn't much, just that the field looked good, real good, and that he was sorry about the picture. Elijah told him it was fine and mostly meant it, and then he did the thing that cost him something, which was to walk the boy up to the collector and show him how it worked, same as the men. Because a person who says he's sorry has already done the hard part, and there's no profit in making him stand in it. Before the afternoon was out, 3 of the men had asked Elijah whether he'd come help them lay something like it before planting next spring. Not whether he could, whether he would, Dale Hutchins asked first, and then 2 others, standing there in the burnt county with the one green field in front of them, asking a 16-year-old to teach them the thing their own fathers had known and let slip into a drawer 40 years back. Elijah told them he would. He meant it, and they could hear that he meant it. And something in the standing around of those men shifted from the shape of neighbors doing a kindness to the shape of men who had come to learn. Wendell Coe drove out that week when he heard and stood at the head of the field next to Amos, the 2 old men about the same age and from about as far apart as 2 men in one county could be, looking at the green stand of it. Coe told Amos that the boy had set the collector where he'd told him to, and it had made the difference. And Amos told Coe that the boy had gotten the diameter out of a booklet an agent named Otis Reed had left at his father's table 60 years before. And the 2 of them stood there a while trading the small pieces of a thing that neither of them had built, and both of them had, in their way, handed down to the one who did. The Japanese farmer and philosopher Masanobu Fukuoka once wrote that the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Elijah Coleman grew soybeans that summer, exceptional soybeans, water-thrifty and deep-rooted and standing green in a county gone brown. Beans that outdid fields worked by men with 40 years on him. But that was not the harvest, and Amos, watching from the porch, was the one who knew it. The harvest was the boy who watched water instead of yield, the boy who drove out to knock on doors and ask grown men for the thing they were throwing away, and kept knocking when the whole town put him on their phones and laughed. The boy who ran the water and failed, and wrapped every joint and ran it and failed again, and went back to the small print a 3rd time instead of walking away. Real knowledge of the land, Amos had always believed, rarely came off expensive equipment. It came from paying attention. It came from understanding that a thing other men discarded still held its purpose in it, whole, waiting on somebody willing to work out what that purpose was. Elijah was still 16 when the county turned around, and by the fall, he was already at the kitchen table most evenings with the pamphlets spread out and a fresh sheet of figures, working out how to carry the system across to the east field. The numbers longer this time and the fall trickier. And Wendell Coe coming by to argue the math with him over the collector placement. His grandfather still read the old booklets every morning with his cold coffee, except now there was a chair pulled up beside his, and most mornings it had somebody in it. The North Quarter stayed in the family. The ground that 5 generations had bled to hold on to stayed whole, kept there by a summer of hauling other people's junk and failing twice, and a 9-foot fall of land nobody had ever bothered to measure. And the pipe that had lain rusting in the fence rows and weed edges all across the county, the pipe men had been glad to be rid of. The pipe they had laughed to give away was carrying water now, quiet and slow and steady, down to the roots of things that were growing. Here's the thing worth holding on to from Elijah's summer, if you take one thing at all. The answer to the hardest problem in front of you is very often already lying somewhere close by, in the shape of something everyone else has decided is worthless. The water was already there in that draw. The pipe was already there in the fence rows. The old knowledge was already there in a drawer. Nobody was missing those things because they were hidden. They were missing them because they'd stopped looking, and because looking closely at what you've been taught to overlook is slow, unglamorous work that makes you, for a while, the person other people laugh at. Elijah's gift wasn't genius. It was attention, and the nerve to keep paying it after failing in front of everyone. That's a thing any of us can choose. The problem you're stuck on this week may be waiting on the same kind of looking. So here's what we'd love to know. What's something in your own life that everybody else wrote off as junk that turned out to matter? Tell us about it down in the comments, because those are the stories we read all the way through. And tell us where in the world you're listening from today. Your town, your country, whatever you feel like sharing, since it always surprises us how far these stories travel. If Elijah's summer stayed with you, consider following along, and we'll meet you back here next time with another one.